You learned that being yourself was wrong, but that truth was never yours. There's a strange feeling that follows many women, as if from a very young age something inside them had been silenced, shaped, suffocated. Not through explicit cruelty, but through glances, gestures and words that subtly implied their authenticity was too much, that their essence needed to be contained, that being themselves was dangerous. And the most disturbing part is that it didn't happen all at once. It was built, slowly, through small corrections, conditional praise, comparisons with those who seemed to fit in better. As if, little by little, you learned that your truth wasn't welcome, that there was something wrong with simply being. Carl Jung would say that everything we repress doesn't disappear. It just hides in the darkness of the unconscious, waiting to be seen. And maybe that's why even today, you feel like you're paying a high price for something you can't even name. But there's something few people realize about all of this. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. Imagine a child with eyes shining with curiosity, a light heart, and a free voice. A child who hasn't yet learned to stay quiet in the face of her own truth. But at some point she heard, "Don't cry. That's ugly. Swallow your tears." And the sound that once was life became silence. It was there, in that subtle and cruel instant, that the habit of repression was born. Because the fear of losing love was greater than the pain of hiding what she felt. In childhood, we are emotional sponges. We absorb everything. Adult expressions, tone of voice, restrained gestures. And even if no one says it in words, we learn to read the environment. We realise that expressing sadness may lead to rejection, that showing anger might be seen as inappropriate, that being too sensitive is a flaw to be corrected. And so, we start repressing entire parts of ourselves without even realising it. What's most unsettling is that this emotional repression doesn't just translate into silence. It turns into masks, into behaviours shaped to please, into forced smiles, into fears we can't name. We grow up with the feeling that something is wrong with us, and we endlessly seek acceptance, trying to fill the void that was born back then when we were forbidden to simply be. This wound doesn't heal with time. It only changes form. It shows up in relationships where you can't stand your ground, in situations where you feel small, even though you are competent, in moments where you stay silent, even when everything inside you is screaming. Because childhood taught you that to love and be loved meant control, containment, performance. And unlearning that takes more than time. It takes courage to look back with compassion, to realise that what you were taught to repress wasn't a flaw, but a vital part of your authenticity. That anger, sadness, fear, all those denied emotions, are part of the true woman you are trying to find again. And perhaps the price you are paying today was planted in childhood, but it no longer needs to be harvested, because there's one detail that changes everything. No one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Carl Jung. What few understand is that even as adults we continue to mould ourselves. And this is what leads us to the next point. The greatest tragedy of the family is the untold. From a very young age, we learn to decipher the desires of others. It's as if emotional survival depended on our ability to please. Gradually, we begin to realise that certain versions of ourselves are more accepted, more praised, more protected. And without noticing, we begin to mould ourselves, recalibrating our gestures, silencing our opinions, softening what we feel, all in exchange for an acceptance that should never have required sacrifice. Being the good girl, the quiet daughter, the woman who doesn't cause trouble. These phrases seem like compliments, but they carry the weight of erasure. Because moulding yourself isn't just adapting, it's hiding your truth in order to be tolerated. And that comes at a heavy price. disconnection from who you truly are. We start living as characters in a story written by others, where our role is to meet expectations, never express essence. The moulding happens in the subtext. It's in "that's not ladylike," in "you're so mature," in "that outfit doesn't suit you." Each seemingly harmless phrase sketches the edges of what is acceptable, and authenticity, suffocated, starts to be seen as a threat, as if being who we really are might leave us alone. And so we wear masks, becoming specialists in roles we never chose. The tragedy is that over time we forget it's an act. We start to believe we truly are what we were trained to be, and any opposing impulse, any desire, any authentic urge, is met with fear. The fear of disappointing, of losing control, of no longer being loved. And the cycle repeats itself, generation after generation, with women who learn to mould themselves to fit a mould that was never theirs. This constant adaptation weakens our confidence. It makes us doubt our emotions, question our desires, distrust our perceptions. Because we were taught to trust others' eyes more than our own inner voice. We were taught to measure ourselves by the reflection in someone else's gaze, and that disconnects us from our most intimate truth. But this leads us to something even deeper. Where your fear ends, your freedom begins. Carl Jung. Because the fear of expressing your truth doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's fed every day by the scars we carry from the past. There comes a moment when silence no longer protects. It starts to hurt. But speaking still feels terrifying. Because when you've spent your entire life moulding yourself to be accepted, showing your truth feels like a threat. And not just any threat. An existential one. Expressing who you really are is like walking naked into a room full of old eyes trained to judge. The fear of expressing your truth is subtle, but fierce. It disguises itself as prudence, as politeness, as rationality. But deep down, it's the old childhood wound, whispering that being yourself might cost you love. That if you dare show your anger, your sadness, your overwhelming joy, someone might abandon you. Because at some point you learnt that being invisible was safer than being rejected. That fear doesn't come from nowhere. It is the logical continuation of everything that was repressed. When you couldn't cry, couldn't say no, couldn't show your desires without fear of punishment or criticism, your body learned to protect itself. And today, even years later, it still reacts with anxiety, with insecurity, with that lump in your throat that appears when you try to speak your truth. Expressing your truth takes courage. Not the courage of feeling no fear, but the courage to act in spite of it. To face the discomfort, the judgment, the silence of others. To say, this hurts me. This I no longer accept. This is who I am. Because only then do you begin to recover the parts of yourself that were left behind. Only then can the true woman emerge from beneath the layers of conditioning. But it's important to recognize this process isn't linear. Sometimes you speak and regret it. Other times you stay silent and blame yourself. Because breaking free from the cycle of repression is like learning to walk again. You stumble, and that's okay, because unlike before, now you know you're coming home, and that home carries the sound of your own voice. It carries the scent of your authenticity. And then, even with fear, you begin to speak, softly at first, then with strength. And before you know it, you begin to listen to yourself with more kindness. And something changes, because for the first time you're choosing yourself, not to please, not to convince, but because you can't live your whole life hiding anymore. And it is at that point, between fear and decision, that something rare is born. Confidence is knowing you might fall, and still choosing to go on. Carl Jung. Because now the next step requires something even more delicate: rebuilding inner trust. Rebuilding inner trust is not a logical process. It's visceral. It's not about repeating motivational phrases in front of the mirror, but about relearning how to listen to what was silenced. Because the truth is, behind every doubt, every self-judgment, there's a voice that still whispers who you really are. And even muffled, it was never extinguished. Have you noticed how we trust others' opinions more than our own feelings? How we hesitate over simple choices, afraid of being wrong? This isn't a lack of intelligence, it's the result of years of being taught to doubt yourself. Childhood and conditioning created a constant noise, a sense that something in you is always wrong, and authenticity became forbidden territory. But trust is like a forgotten muscle. It doesn't matter how long it's been unused, it's still there, and with every small decision made in truth, it gains strength. With every no said with firmness, every yes said with courage, you move closer to yourself. Not as someone reinventing herself, but as someone remembering. Remembering who she was before she started moulding herself to fit in. This process demands gentleness, because the true woman you want to reconnect with is still afraid. She needs time, space, listening. A place where she can make mistakes, contradict herself, rebuild. There is no reconstruction without respect for the soul's rhythm. Inner trust blossoms in the fertile soil of self-care, not in the barren ground of self-judgment. And you might ask, how do I trust myself after so long doubting? The answer is, one step at a time. Start by listening to what bothers you, even if it seems small. Start naming what you feel, even if no one understands. Start with you. Because every time you choose yourself, you send a message to your unconscious. I'm here, I see you, and I trust you. And then, something quiet begins to change. You no longer need external validation to exist. You no longer need others' approval to feel whole, because for the first time, you are anchored in yourself, and that anchor does not move with the tides of opinion. It is grounded in your essence. But there is still something that must happen for this transformation to be complete. The tree that grows toward the light also sends roots into the shadows. Carl Jung. Because only those who allow themselves to be seen truly trust. Showing yourself again is not about shouting to the world who you are. It's about stopping hiding from yourself. It's about letting the light of your authenticity shine through, even if still trembling. The cracks of fear. And this requires more than courage. It requires surrender. Because after so long being conditioned to mould yourself, revealing who you are is an act of sacred rebellion. Showing yourself is a risk. It means admitting that you might be misunderstood, rejected, judged. But it also means making room for real, deep connections, where love doesn't depend on performance, but on presence. That's where the true woman is born, the one who isn't defined by the masks she wears, but by the wholeness with which she inhabits her own body, her own feelings, her own story. And yes, there will be setbacks, moments when fear speaks louder than courage, when the impulse to remain silent feels safer than the freedom of being. But every time you choose to show up, even trembling, you affirm to yourself, I deserve to be seen. And that sense of worth is revolutionary for someone who learned that silence was the only safe place. Authenticity is not a destination, it's a path. And this path is often paved with hesitant steps. But each step is a silent declaration of existence, an act of resistance against everything you were taught about who you should be. And the more you walk, the more you realise you don't need to be perfect. You just need to be whole. There is something deeply liberating about being yourself. Not the version that pleases, but the version that pulses, that feels, that lives. The one who cries when she's sad, laughs loudly when she's happy, and stays silent when she needs quiet, not to hide but to listen. This woman is rare. And when she rises, the world doesn't bow in adoration, but in respect. To show yourself is not to explain yourself, it is to own yourself. And when you do that, something around you changes. Relationships transform, fragile bonds fall away. True ones grow stronger, because those who have the courage to show up invite others to do the same. And that's how a new way of existing is born. Where love doesn't demand disguises, but celebrates truths. And maybe the most beautiful part of it all is realizing that you were never broken. You were just taught to doubt yourself, to hide in order to survive. But now you are living. And living, with all that it entails, is the purest form of freedom there is. And then everything makes sense. In the end, the answer was always there. Being yourself was never the problem. The problem was being made to believe it was. What you've lived until now was not failure nor weakness, it was survival. Every mask you wore was a shield, every silence a subtle plea for love. Every time you moulded yourself, it was because your soul, still a child, believed it was the only way to keep being loved. But now, you're no longer that child, and even if fear still lingers, you have something she didn't. Consciousness. And then, everything makes sense. You spent your life trying to be enough for others. But deep down, what you were really looking for was permission to be yourself. But that permission was never meant to come from the outside, because the world doesn't know who you are. But you do, you always have. And now that knowing is beginning to find a voice, it's no longer about fixing who you became. It's about reclaiming who you've always been. The true woman, the one who, even wounded, was never lost. The one who, even in silence, kept the flame of authenticity alive. The one who, even afraid, now chooses to be seen. The repression of childhood, the fear, the shaping, all of it formed a cocoon. And what you feel now, this silent urgency, is not fragility. It's the call to break free, to open your wings, to trust what you feel, to live fully, without apologizing for being whole. But are we truly ready to accept this? To accept that healing is not about becoming someone else, but about returning to ourselves. That it's not about being strong all the time. Real. Even when that means being vulnerable. That the greatest act of courage is not facing the world, but looking within and saying, I will not abandon myself anymore. And this is where everything changes. When you understand that being yourself was never the mistake, it was always the way. If up until now you felt that there was something wrong with simply being, maybe the problem was never you. Maybe the problem was a world that didn't know how to hold space for you just as you are. But now something has changed, because you are beginning to see yourself, to hear yourself, to remember. And this is the first step in a journey back home. A journey where authenticity is no longer a risk, but a necessity. Where you stop asking for permission to exist and start living with the wholeness of someone who understands that true love never demands self-abandonment. Now is the time to take the first step. Start applying these ideas today, and then tell me in the comments how the experience was. Share what touched you most, what made sense, what echoed in your story. Your voice matters, and this is a safe space for it to be heard. Which part of this journey resonated most with you? Share it in the comments. Your words might help another woman see she is not alone. And if you want to go even deeper into this universe, watch the recommended video above. It might be the next step in your path of reconnection with your truth. See you in the next video.